So in this video, I'll be showing you guys how to make Titus's sword, also known as the Brotherhood Sword from Final Fantasy X. This is part 1 of 2 videos, and in this part I'll be showing you guys how I personally make the plug for the mold, and then in the second part I'll show you how to make the mold and cast the sword. Okay, so jumping right in, what I first did was I created an illustration of the sword in Illustrator. I then had to cut it up into 6 different images so I could actually fit the sword onto 8.5 by 11 inch pieces of paper, so then I could make it the size I actually wanted. I printed it originally at 100% and I just found it was a little too big for my liking, so when I printed it I made sure they were all at 80%. And obviously I taped the pieces of paper together so I can have one giant cutout of the sword, which I can then trace onto EVA foam. Also, I will have a link in the video description box below so you can download my illustration. You can either download it in 6 different images, which make it easier for you guys to print it out, or you can download one whole image. And here is the template for the sword, all cut out. Now we can finally start cutting out some EVA foam. So as you can see here, I'm using contact cement for the EVA foam. This is contact cement as well. It's all gone, I'm just using the brush that comes with it. And so here, because I personally don't have pieces of EVA foam long enough to fit the whole sword on, I have to glue it together. So I'm just gonna glue it, cut it, and then skip ahead so you don't have to watch all that. So here we have the base of the sword all cut out and glued together. For the center I used EVA foam with a thickness of 10 millimeters and the sides were 6 millimeters. I did decide that I wanted it a little thicker later, so I added 2 millimeters on either side, but it's really not necessary because I later add expanding foam anyway. I was pretty much making this up as I went, so I wouldn't have used the 2 millimeter foam had I known I was going to use EVA foam later. So I guess I should have mentioned this sooner, but you will need to print out and tape 2 sword templates. The second one doesn't have to be the whole sword, just the parts where you can get the details of the hilt, because we're going to cut out EVA foam for the details as well. So here I'm just carving away at the edges of the sword so that it comes to somewhat of a point, but it really doesn't have to be perfect because we're going to be adding expanding foam anyway. Now, on to the expanding foam. One thing I would like to say about expanding foam is, at least my issue with it, is if I don't use a whole can, I often find that the expanding foam dries up in the nozzle and then I can't even use the rest of it later. So if anyone has any tips or tricks on how to preserve the life of it, please share because it would be greatly appreciated. So as for this section, I'm really not sure what happened. I don't know if I lost the footage or just forgot to record it, but basically once the expanding foam was done drying, I just carved it to the shape I wanted. For sections like this, like the pointed EVA foam, I had to add epoxy sculpt to it because the points were too flimsy, so it needed some sort of stability. Usually I will add PETG, like I'll sandwich it in between the EVA foam, but in this case I just forgot. That or I was just being lazy. And then here I'm literally just covering the expanding foam in masking tape to give it a smooth surface so we can then coat it in this, well, it's not exactly paper mache clay because there's actually no paper in it and I can never get paper mache clay smooth enough without sanding it, so I kind of made my own recipe based off of other things I found online. So for the recipe I used all-purpose white flour, Plaster of Paris, Elmer's glue, and joint compound by Sheetrock. Technically you probably don't need plaster and joint compound, but I just had both so I figured why not. Also, I'm sorry I don't have an exact recipe for this, but I just kind of eyeballed everything. But you'd probably be safe with a roughly equal amount of flour, plaster, and joint compound. And then just add the glue until you like the texture, and if the consistency still isn't thin enough, add a little bit of water, because that's what I did. You just want to make sure it's thin enough to where you can smooth it on easily with your fingers but not have it drip off your object, but also not too thick to where you just get like big globs of it and then you have to sand it down. Like even here you can probably tell that the mixture's a little too thin. I do go and thicken it up later, but I mean it worked. And then that stuff you see under the plaster mixture, it was just my attempt at paper mache while using wheat flour. Don't use wheat flour, only use white flour. In fact, you could probably just skip the paper mache step altogether. I make these mistakes so you don't have to. And here we have the correct mixture of plaster, flour, joint compound glue, and water. As you can probably tell, I already did a few coats. I let the other ones dry first. And as you can see here, I thickened up the mixture with a little more flour just to build up some of the parts that need a little more height. Now for the handle of the sword, I used 2 sizes of PVC pipe, one with an inner diameter of 1 inch and the outer diameter being 1 5/16 of an inch. The actual handle for the sword and the smaller PVC pipe has an inner diameter of 3/4 of an inch and the outer diameter being 1 1/16 of an inch. And just in case you're wondering, yeah, these 2 pieces don't actually fit together. So what I did was I heated up the smaller PVC pipe with a heat gun to soften it up a little and make it more pliable so I can, smush these pieces together like that. It takes a couple tries, but I get it. So before you cover your sword in expanding foam, make sure to cut out a chunk of EVA foam out of this area here, and then glue a piece of 2mm EVA foam to either side of the sword. Slice off any excess foam, and then fill that cavity up with some glue. I used epoxy resin. Now slide in that hilt we just made and let the glue dry. So for this part here, I used epoxy sculpt. We're working on this little lip here to give it a nice smooth transition rather than a blunt edge. I found it best to do this step once the plaster mixture was on. And one last thing I forgot to mention before moving on to the next part, get yourself one of these. They're pipe cutters and they will be your best friend when working with PVC pipe. So now we finally get to start sanding some stuff.
This is where the fun begins.
Make sure you have all the detailed pieces cut out beforehand just to make things go quicker and smoother. Also, if you don't have a Dremel, also known as a rotary tool, I suggest you get one because we're going to be doing a lot of sanding. And if you happen to be wondering why the sword is pink all of a sudden, it's because I gave it a few coats of epoxy resin and I just happened to add red food coloring to it, which in turn made it pink. I put resin on the sword just because I'm not sure if the plaster mixture is waterproof because of the flour in it, and since I'm going to be pouring silicone on it, I'm not sure if it needs to be waterproof or not, but I was like, better safe than sorry. So I use this tool for this part here. You can also use a soldering iron if you have one. I used a combination of both. And then for the next part, make sure you have yourself a case of assorted O-rings. I use this size here. And trust me, you do want a case because you will be using some other sizes later. And then for this part here, I used this tip to kind of create that little divot here. You want to make sure it's roughly the same size as the O-ring we picked out. And that's about it in terms of sanding. I'm just going to finish up these pieces for the other side, but I think you get the idea, so I'm just going to skip ahead. Now before I skip too far ahead, I just wanted to show you one of the ways I build back up my EVA foam if I've sanded too much down. There's a lot of ways to do it, but in this particular situation, I added epoxy sculpt and then just sanded down any excess. Also, you may have noticed that I already glued some of the details on. Don't worry, it's just one side. I'll show you the gluing process for the other side later. I just needed it glued on a little bit because this piece that my thumb is holding back here actually goes over the piece that I'm sanding. I just wanted to make sure that those two pieces lined up properly, and I found gluing the details down ahead of time was the easiest way to do that. You also may have noticed that this is the section I mentioned earlier where we add epoxy sculpt to the hilt. I pretty much just used an X-Acto knife to add like the dividing details, or I just cut the clay away for this blunt edge here, and then just sanded down this area here till it looked like one cohesive piece. And then just a helpful tip, if you use water, like if you dip your fingers in water while working with the epoxy sculpt, it will give you a much smoother surface so you won't have to do as much sanding. For some reason I didn't do that, and I don't know why. Maybe I just didn't want to get a cup of water. However, looking back on it now, I wish I had, because it would have saved me a lot of time. And then after all that sanding, glue down your pieces with contact cement. When it comes to contact cement, it's best to apply glue to both your piece and the area you're gluing it to. And then you want to wait about a minute until the glue is tacky, because then when you put the pieces together, it will stick almost instantly, versus if you try to glue it right away, it'll just slide all over the place. Also, one thing I like to do when I don't want to wait for the glue to dry, I'll take a paper towel and wipe off all the excess. It doesn't work quite as good as it would if you just let it dry, but it works pretty good. When gluing down this piece here, you probably will get some gaps in between like the transition of the foam to the sword. So what I did was I just stuffed some clay in between the gaps. Any air dry clay will work, but I used Model Magic. Now grab your heat gun and start heating up the surface of the EVA foam, which essentially I guess you're melting it a little bit. This will help prevent the foam from absorbing all your paint when you go to paint it. You will have to prime it before painting, but if you happen to forget this step, you will have to use a lot more primer. Trust me, I've done it before. So now I'm just mixing up part A and B of my epoxy sculpt, and I'm going to show you how I did this, but in this area over here. Now grab your box of assorted O-rings, and we're going to be working with this size here. One thing I will say is this area here was a lot easier to get the clay just right because of the little divot we were able to make, versus this area here we weren't able to make a divot, so I had to work a little harder to get the clay just right. Now moving on to the bubbles, and yes, I am still using epoxy sculpt. One thing you want to do in this particular situation is make sure the clay is completely dried before moving on to the other side, otherwise you might accidentally flatten all the bubbles you just made. Now on to more sanding. I know I didn't show you guys the gluing process of this part, but really all I did was take some scraps of EVA foam, glued it, and then just started sanding it to the shape I wanted. I really didn't think about this step until I got to it and realized I needed to build up the EVA foam. Now you may not have to do this step, but I felt like the bubbles needed just a little bit of sanding. Now grab yourself some Quick Seal Plus and then start filling in the gaps of your EVA foam. Now there are other things you can use to fill in the gaps of your EVA foam, but I happen to have Quick Seal Plus and it's what I use most of the time anyway, so. There are some downsides to Quick Seal Plus, of course. Like if you have a fairly big gap in your foam, you will have to do multiple coats. Like you'll have to do a coat and then wait for it to dry and then do another coat and then, repeat that until you have as many coats as needed. And that is the end of part 1 for my Brotherhood Sword tutorial. Thank you guys so much for watching. If you guys enjoyed the video, please give it a thumbs up. If you'd like to see any more videos like this, please subscribe. And if you'd like to be notified for any future videos by me, hit the little bell icon, and I guess I'll see you guys in the next video. Toodles!